In the quiet moments before sleep, a new world of stories begins at Mythical Story Time. We venture into the depths of secrets, uncovering hidden knowledge and exploring tales that captivate the mind. If you're ready to drift into a restful sleep, join us, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories to come.
Edgar Cayce was born in 1877 in a farmhouse near Hopkinsville, Kentucky. The rural town was unremarkable in almost every way. But the boy born there would become one of the most documented and controversial prophetic figures of the 20th century. Raised in a devout Christian household, Cayce was a quiet, deeply spiritual child. His mother, Carrie, was nurturing and religious, while his father, Leslie, was more skeptical and practical. From early on, Edgar spoke of visions and invisible companions by age 10. He claimed he could see beings of light and hear voices that spoke not to his ears, but to something deeper. His connection to the Bible became an obsession. He reportedly read it cover to cover more than 100 times in his lifetime. As a boy, he sometimes dozed off with scripture open on his chest, saying it helped him understand the stories better in his dreams. Teachers noted he had trouble with rote memorization, but showed an unusual gift for insight and comprehension, especially with spiritual texts. One day, frustrated with a school lesson, Edgar placed his spelling book beneath his pillow and went to sleep. The next morning, he claimed to have absorbed all the material, whether that detail is exaggerated or not. From that point on, his family began to notice something strange. Edgar Cayce seemed to know things he hadn't learned. As he entered adulthood, Cayce left school in the 9th grade to help support his family. He became a photographer, eventually marrying Gertrude Evans in 1903. By all appearances, he was a normal man, working quietly, attending church, staying out of trouble. But in 1900, something changed. A severe case of laryngitis struck and left him unable to speak above a whisper for months. Doctors couldn't explain it. Remedies failed. His ability to work as a photographer, which required constant communication, was in jeopardy. Desperate, he met a traveling hypnotist named Hal Lane, who offered to try something experimental, hypnosis. Cayce agreed. During the session, something remarkable happened. While in a trance, he spoke clearly. For the first time in months, not only that, he diagnosed his own condition, described the underlying problem, and prescribed a treatment involving increased blood circulation. Lane followed his instructions. Within days, Cayce's voice returned. This was the first documented case of what would become known as a Cayce reading. Lane was intrigued. He convinced Cayce to try additional sessions, this time diagnosing others. Cayce was hesitant. As a devout Christian, he feared what he was doing might be spiritually dangerous. He only agreed under strict conditions, that each session would begin with a prayer, be done for good, and never be used for personal profit. Soon, people began arriving from across the region. A child with epilepsy, a man with chronic stomach pain, a woman bedridden with arthritis. Cayce would lie on a couch, fall into a trance, and speak. His wife Gertrude or Lane would record every word. The details were extraordinary. He used medical terminology he had never studied, described conditions he couldn't have known about, and suggested treatments that, in many cases, worked by 1910. Cayce had completed hundreds of readings that same year. A feature in the New York Times brought national attention. Doctors, journalists, and skeptics began traveling to Kentucky to witness the phenomenon. One physician brought a list of anonymous patients. Cayce, unaware of their names or conditions, accurately described their symptoms and offered plausible treatments. Even skeptics admitted the results were difficult to explain. Each reading was transcribed and stored. Over time, the collection grew into the thousands. Cayce never remembered anything he said while in trance. He was often shocked by what others told him he had spoken, despite national attention. He maintained his religious convictions and feared losing his moral compass. He refused to charge for readings directly, surviving on photography and occasional donations. Eventually, his readings expanded beyond medicine. He began to speak about dreams, spiritual growth, the nature of the soul, and even past lives. These topics would become more central in later years. But during this period, Cayce still focused primarily on healing. His followers included doctors, clergy, and ordinary people. Some came to be cured. Others came to ask questions about the universe, their purpose, or their past. By the 1920s, Cayce's reputation had grown far beyond Kentucky. He relocated to Virginia Beach, where the Association for Research and Enlightenment was formed to catalog and study his readings. Gertrude continued to oversee the sessions. Gladys Davis, his stenographer, began transcribing them in detail. These archives would become one of the largest collections of psychic material in modern history. Over 14,000 readings in total, despite personal doubts and exhaustion. Cayce continued. Sometimes he performed multiple readings a day. He would often become physically ill afterward, drained by the effort. Yet he refused to stop. He believed that if he was helping people, it was worth the toll. By the time of his death in 1945, Edgar Cayce had become a legend. Not because of flashy predictions or public performances, but because of the sheer volume of documented cases, many of which were medically confirmed. He never sought fame, and often questioned the source of his ability. But he followed it anyway, and whether you believe his gift came from the subconscious, the divine, or something science has yet to explain, the record is there, the lives he touched, the cures he suggested, the predictions he left behind, all still stand, waiting to be studied. Michel Nostradamus was born in December of 1503 in the small Provençal town of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, France. He would become known to history as Nostradamus, one of the most controversial and studied prophetic figures of all time. He lived during one of Europe's most turbulent centuries, a period marked by plague, religious war, and collapsing political orders. His family was of Jewish origin, though they had converted to Catholicism a generation earlier, a move likely made to avoid persecution in an increasingly intolerant society. Nostradamus grew up in a world where science, faith, and superstition collided as a young man. Nostradamus studied medicine at the University of Montpellier, one of the most respected medical institutions in Europe at the time. However, his unorthodox ideas and refusal to blindly follow accepted dogma earned him criticism. He was nearly expelled for practicing apothecary work during a plague quarantine, something forbidden to medical students. Despite this, he persisted. By the 1530s, he had become widely known for his work treating plague victims across southern France. Unlike many of his peers, Nostradamus didn't rely solely on bloodletting or superstition. He promoted hygiene, clean air, and herbal treatments. He encouraged patients to remove infected corpses, sanitize living spaces, and boil their drinking water, basic practices by modern standards, but revolutionary in a time when disease was often blamed on divine punishment or bad air. These methods earned him both admiration and enemies. In 1534, personal tragedy struck. His wife and 2 children died, likely from the plague. The event shattered him, both emotionally and spiritually. He disappeared from public life for several years, traveling across Europe, possibly studying mysticism, astrology, and ancient texts. By the 1540s, he had re-emerged not as a physician, but as an astrologer and writer of prophetic almanacs. These almanacs became immensely popular. They combined seasonal weather forecasts, calendars, herbal advice, and cryptic predictions. People across France eagerly read them, and Nostradamus's fame began to grow. Encouraged by this success, he began working on a much larger, more ambitious project, a book of long-range prophecies. In 1555, Nostradamus published the first installment of Les Prophéties, a collection of 940 to 4-line verses. Known as quatrains, the language was deliberately obscure, a mix of Old French, Latin, Greek, and regional dialects. The quatrains contain symbolism, metaphors, and wordplay designed to conceal their meaning. Nostradamus claimed he used astrology and divine inspiration to write them, though he also admitted that much of his insight came from studying historical cycles. Critics often say his predictions are too vague to be meaningful, but many passages seem eerily specific. One of the most cited examples is Century I, Quatrain 35. It describes a young lion piercing the eye of an older one in battle. In 1559, King Henry II of France was killed in a jousting match when a splintered lance penetrated his eye. Through his helmet, the king's opponent was younger and bore a lion on his shield. Another example is Century II, Quatrain 24. It is interpreted to refer to a man rising from modest origins who would reshape Europe. The passage is often linked to Napoleon Bonaparte, who did exactly that in the early 1800s. Then there's Century II, Quatrain 62, which speaks of a history leading great armies in Western Europe. Many associate this with Adolf Hitler, though skeptics point out that Hister was a classical name for the Danube River. In 1666, the Great Fire of London devastated the city. One quatrain reads, "The blood of the just will be demanded of London, burnt by fire in the year 66. This verse is frequently cited as a prediction of that disaster. Whether coincidence or foresight, such connections kept his work alive through centuries. But Nostradamus's reputation wasn't built solely on prophecy. He navigated political and religious landscapes with care. France in the mid-16th century was a hotbed of religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants. Openly claiming mystical or prophetic power could be fatal heresy trials and burnings were common. To avoid persecution, Nostradamus wrote cryptically and distanced himself from the more extreme interpretations of his work. Still, suspicion followed him. In 1556, the Inquisition investigated him. He managed to avoid serious punishment, likely due to powerful allies such as Catherine de' Medici, the queen consort of King Henry II. She became one of his most important patrons. After her husband's death, she invited Nostradamus to court, where he served as a royal advisor and astrologer. Nostradamus continued writing until his death in 1566. According to legend, the night before he died, he told his secretary, "You will not find me alive at sunrise, true or not." The story endured, like so many surrounding his life. During the French Revolution, his tomb was reportedly opened by soldiers. Some accounts say they found a medallion with the date of the exhumation inscribed on it, another layer to his legend. Though never verified, over the centuries, Nostradamus's work has been continuously reinterpreted. His prophecies were used as propaganda during World War II by both the Nazis and the Allies. The British produced fake Nostradamus predictions suggesting German defeat and dropped them over enemy lines. In the modern era, his name is invoked in connection with everything from 9/11s to pandemics to the rise of artificial intelligence. The truth is that Nostradamus wrote in riddles. The same quatrain can be applied to multiple events, depending on how it's read. This ambiguity has fueled both belief and skepticism. Scholars argue that confirmation bias drives many of the interpretations that people see what they want to see, but others argue that even if only a handful of his predictions are accurate, they deserve attention. What makes Nostradamus unique isn't he just what he wrote, it as how long. His words have lasted. Les Prophecies has never gone out of print. His name remains part of global conversation, invoked whenever the world faces crisis or uncertainty. Was he a prophet, a poet, a man who studied the past so carefully that he glimpsed patterns in the future? Whatever the answer, Nostradamus shaped how the Western world thinks about prediction, foresight, and fate. And more than 450 years after his death, we're still reading his words, searching, wondering, and waiting. Born in 1911 in Strumica, a town nestled within the Ottoman Empire at the time, Vangelia Pandeva Dimitrova arrived in a world filled with instability. The Balkan Peninsula was a land of contested borders, collapsing empires, and cultural collision. Her early life was shaped by war and poverty. Her mother died when she was very young, and her father, a soldier conscripted into the Bulgarian army during World War I, was left to raise her in a time of great national hardship. She was not born into comfort or fame. Her family was poor, and Vanga, like many girls in a village, was expected to help at home and contribute to the survival of the household. She was an ordinary child by all accounts until, at age 12, an event occurred that changed her life and her place in history forever. A violent storm reportedly swept through her village. According to both family accounts and local law, Vanga was lifted by the wind and thrown into a nearby field. When she was found, her eyes were sealed shut with sand and dirt, and her family could not afford the surgery or medical treatment that might have saved her vision. Her eyes eventually healed to a point, but she was permanently blind. But Vanga soon claimed that she began to experience something else visions. She said she could see not with her eyes, but with her mind. She spoke of people who would die. She warned of events that had not yet happened. Some villagers dismissed it as superstition or imagination. But others began to take her seriously when her statements started matching reality. At first, she spoke to neighbors and family members. She warned them of illnesses, injuries, and travel accidents. As more predictions appeared to come true, strangers began to visit. News of the blind girl with vision spread beyond her village. Word traveled slowly, mostly by rumor, sometimes by radio, but eventually reached Bulgaria's capital by the time of World War II. Baba Vanga, as she came to be called, had become a household name in Bulgaria. Baba was an honorific, a respectful title for an elder woman, though she was still relatively young. Soldiers, politicians, and grieving families began making their way to her home in the remote town of Petric. They came seeking answers, some hopeful, some desperate. Despite living in a socialist regime that outwardly rejected religion and mysticism, Vanga was quietly supported by the Bulgarian government. Officials from the Interior Ministry and National Intelligence Services visited her, not always for formal reasons, but out of personal belief or curiosity. One such official was General Georgi Lozanov, a Bulgarian parapsychologist who helped form the Institute of Suggestology, which quietly monitored psychic and paranormal phenomena under the communist regime by the 1960s. The state had assigned her a government secretary to record her consultations. These transcripts, often handwritten, documented who visited, what they asked, what she said, and, in many cases, what later happened. Many of these documents remain locked in Bulgarian archives, though portions have surfaced over the years. One of the most documented forecasts came in 1980, when she said, at the turn of the century, in August of 1999 or 2000, Kursk will be covered with water, and the whole world will weep over it. At the time, many believed she was speaking of the Russian city of Kursk. But in August 2000, the Russian submarine named Kursk sank during naval exercises, killing all 118 aboard. The incident captured international attention and was considered by many as validation of Vanga's warning. Another statement attributed to her described steel birds attacking the American brethren and innocent blood flooding. After the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks, this quote was widely shared, though its original transcription has been questioned. It's not found in government archives, leading some researchers to suspect it was paraphrased or invented posthumously. In the early 1990s, she is said to have warned of a conflict in the Middle East triggered by people wearing black robes and carrying black flags. Supporters associate this with the rise of ISIS and the Syrian civil war. However, as with many such claims, the documentation remains second-hand at best. More verifiable are her recorded sessions where she predicted shifts in world leadership. According to one archive, she described a future American leader who would be dark-skinned and come at a time of global crisis. This was later tied to Barack Obama. She reportedly said he would be the last U.S. president, a cryptic statement that has since been widely interpreted but remains ambiguous. Unlike Western psychics who often appeared on television or released books, Vanga never capitalized on her abilities. She gave no interviews. She didn't publish a memoir. She didn't even keep personal notes. Everything we know comes from people who were present, many of whom were skeptical scientists, doctors, journalists, or bureaucrats. She lived modestly in a two-room home. She dressed simply, accepted small offerings, but never set a fee. Her fame never translated into luxury. According to multiple testimonies, she spent most of her day in prayer, silence, or meeting visitors. She declined requests when she didn't feel clarity. "The book is closed," she would say. "It is not for me to know." Visitors described her state during predictions as trance-like. She would often sit perfectly still, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the room. Her tone was quiet, emotionless, and matter-of-fact. She didn't comfort. She didn't elaborate. She simply stated what she claimed to see. Skeptics point out that many of her statements were general. Illness, accidents, disasters, these are common human experiences. And once she became a national figure, there was incentive for people to interpret her words in ways that fit their lives. Posthumous attributions, in particular, have likely distorted her legacy. Still, even cautious researchers acknowledge that her accuracy according to first-hand records was unusually high. Some estimates suggest that over 70% of her documented readings were judged to be accurate or partially accurate by those who received them. A team of Bulgarian scientists in the 1980s conducted interviews and follow-ups with hundreds of people she spoke to. The conclusions were not definitive, but they showed a consistency difficult to explain away as chance. Before her death in 1996, Vanga requested that her home be preserved as a museum and her records be protected. Today, the Baba Vanga Museum still stands in Petric. Her room is kept exactly as she left it, and visitors from around the world travel to walk the path to her door. She remains a cultural icon in the Balkans and a subject of fascination worldwide. Her name trends on the internet every time a crisis emerges. Documentaries explore her life. Her predictions are compiled, disputed, and recompiled endlessly. Her legend, whether fully earned or partially built after the fact, has taken on a life of its own. Was she a prophet, a psychic, or a perceptive observer of human behavior? Did she access something spiritual, or was she simply a master of reading people and patterns? These questions remain unanswered. What is clear is that Baba Vanga touched lives at every level of society, from the illiterate farmer to the head of state. Her blindness became a symbol of a different kind of vision. And though she never saw the world with her eyes, she gave voice to fears and futures that others could only sense. In a century defined by war, collapse, and reinvention, she stood alone in a small house on the edge of Europe and quietly became one of its most enduring mysteries. Jeane Dixon was born Lydia Emma Pinkett in Medford, Wisconsin, in 1904. The daughter of German immigrants. Her family moved to California when she was still a child, and it was there on the West Coast, during the roaring early decades of the 20th century that she began claiming visions. According to her, the first came at age 8, when a traveling New Money fortune teller read her palm and declared that she would one day become a great prophetess. Dixon herself would later say she began seeing premonitions not long after. Raised in a devout Catholic household, Jeane's religious beliefs would become the foundation of her worldview. And like many self-described psychics or astrologers, Dixon claimed her visions came directly from God. She often said she saw images as if projected on a screen in her mind, usually accompanied by a spiritual presence. This dual identity as both devout Christian and modern mystic made her appealing to a wide audience. Her frequent use of religious language in explaining her prophecies helped her bridge the gap between conservative American Christianity and fringe spirituality. Her first brush with public attention came in the 1930s and 1940s, when she began working as an astrologer and psychic consultant in Washington. She read for politicians, business leaders, and celebrities. Her horoscopes were syndicated in hundreds of newspapers, and she quickly gained a reputation as the seer of the powerful. Dixon managed to market herself in a time when most psychics were considered entertainers or charlatans. She presented herself instead as a serious, God-fearing woman who just happened to see the future. But it wasn't until 1956 that her name became forever linked with American political prophecy. In that year, she was featured in Parade magazine, one of the most widely circulated publications in the United States. In a brief article, she predicted that the 1960 U.S. presidential election would be won by a Democrat who would die in office. At the time, the forecast was noticed but not taken too seriously. Then, in 1963, when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, people remembered. That prediction catapulted Dixon into national fame. She was hailed as the woman who saw it coming. Bookings flooded in. Her syndication expanded, and she was suddenly seen as more than a local curiosity. She was a national phenomenon. Although skeptics later pointed out that she had made conflicting predictions about the 1960 election in other venues, the public didn't care. This selective memory would later become a well-known psychological concept, the Jeane Dixon effect, the tendency to focus on successful predictions while forgetting the failures. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, Dixon's influence expanded behind the scenes. It was widely rumored and later confirmed through memoirs and staff interviews that she advised several U.S. presidents. Richard Nixon, in particular, was fascinated by her insights. According to multiple sources, he consulted her regularly and even shared her writings with kids. In tapes released years later, Nixon can be heard referencing astrological advice. Dixon reportedly warned him of betrayal and scandal warnings that gained new weight during the Watergate crisis. She also had contact with Ronald and Nancy Reagan, while the Reagans did not officially acknowledge her rule. It is now well known that Nancy Reagan relied heavily on astrological guidance during her husband's presidency, especially after the 1981 assassination attempt, though Dixon wasn't their only advisor. Her writings were read and circulated in those inner circles. Her predictions spanned far beyond politics. Dixon foresaw Robert F. Kennedy's death, Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, and unrest in the Middle East. She also predicted the rise of the Soviet Union and later its fall. She spoke about space travel and new diseases. She even warned of a terrorist attack in New York, decades before. Some of these claims were printed in books and columns. Others were retroactively cited, sometimes with evidence, sometimes not. One of her most repeated visions was that of the Antichrist. In her 1971 book The Call to Glory, she described a boy born somewhere in the Middle East who would rise to power by the end of the 20th century. She claimed he would lead the world into a third world war before being defeated by divine forces. This prophecy resonated deeply with religious readers and helped secure her standing among Christian conservatives. Dixon's visions were not always dark. She also predicted moments of peace and prosperity. But the warnings made more headlines. She forecast economic collapse, environmental disaster, and a coming spiritual reckoning. She often described the United States as a chosen nation being tested by moral decay and external threats. These themes mirrored Cold War anxieties and helped cement her as a voice of cultural conscience in a time of ideological warfare. Critics were not silent. Scientists and skeptics dismissed her as vague and opportunistic. The Committee for a Skeptical Inquiry analyzed her predictions and found that her success rate was no better than chance. They argued that her vague language references to great men falling or turmoil in the East could be interpreted in dozens of ways. And they accused her of retroactively revising her predictions in later editions of her books. Still, she had millions of followers. Her daily horoscope column reached an estimated 60 million readers at its peak. Her books, such as A Gift of Prophecy and My Life and Prophecies, were bestsellers. She made frequent appearances on talk shows and was interviewed in magazines like Time, Life, and the New York Times. Her face became instantly recognizable. Dixon also founded the nonprofit Children to Children Foundation, intended to promote child welfare and spiritual education. Although some questioned the financial transparency of her foundation, others praised her efforts to use her fame for what she saw as moral good. Toward the end of her life, she made one last series of prophecies. She warned of global upheaval around the year 2000. Her final interviews included references to a massive shift in human consciousness and a reckoning of empires. These vague but evocative phrases were interpreted in various ways during the Y2K panic and the early years of the War on Terror. She died in 1997 at the age of 93. After her death, her belongings, including years of handwritten notes, taped readings, and letters from politicians, became the subject of legal battles and academic interest. Some of the files were donated to libraries or religious archives. Others disappeared into private hands. Jeane Dixon remains a polarizing figure. For some, she was a charlatan who used religion to mask guesswork. For others, she was a genuine mystic whose accuracy was diluted by the sheer volume of what she published. But almost everyone agrees on one thing: she was a force in American popular culture. She wasn't just a prophet, she was a brand. Her influence reached into politics, religion, media, and daily life. She helped shape the way Americans thought about fate and forecasting. In a country obsessed with both control and catastrophe, she offered a glimpse of order in the chaos, even if that glimpse was sometimes unclear. Her story doesn't end with her death. Her name resurfaces whenever the world feels on edge, Her books still circulate. Her predictions, some verified, others debated, still echo. What happens when you listen to voices spread across time, scattered across continents, wrapped in different tongues and buried under layers of belief? You begin to notice something beneath the symbols. Beyond the mysticism, there are patterns. Edgar Cayce, Nostradamus, Baba Vanga, and Jeane Dixon. They came from different centuries, lived through different cultures, and spoke to very different audiences. But the deeper you look, the more you realize they were orbiting the same themes. All spoke of a people. Each one described cataclysmic change not as a possibility, but as a certainty. Cayce envisioned entire coastlines vanishing, magnetic poles shifting, continents sinking and rising. Nostradamus warned of firestorms, invasions and floods. Vanga, blind but piercing, predicted a world reshaped by wars and viruses. Dixon saw nations crumble and world leaders fall. The specifics may differ, but the message is consistent. The world will not stay still. These visions weren't always detailed. Often, they came cloaked in symbols. Nostradamus rarely used names or dates. Cayce spoke in trance-like riddles. Vanga used simple language, but left interpretation to others. Dixon was direct, but her accuracy was mixed. And yet, people still listened. Why? Because even when their words were ambiguous, they pointed toward something the human so recognizes instinctively, that stability is an illusion. Prophecy, when stripped of drama, is about pattern recognition. Each of these figures noticed currents that others ignored. Cayce observed illness and imbalance in the body and in society. Nostradamus absorbed the chaos of 16th century Europe and saw echoes in the future. Vanga, grounded in a Cold War world, sensed global powers shifting violently. Dixon saw moral erosion mirrored in political turmoil. They didn't invent these fears. They tapped into them. This is what makes their visions compelling. Not that they forecast specific events with GPS-level accuracy, but that they captured the emotional truth of their times. And those emotional truths echo. Cayce's predictions about environmental destruction seem more relevant now than when he spoke them. He warned that coastlines would shift, that Japan might sink, and that parts of New York would be submerged. Suddenly, Cayce's visions weren't just spiritual ramblings. They looked disturbingly familiar. Nostradamus's cryptic verses have been mined endlessly for meaning. One quatrain, written in the 16th century, reads, "To steal birds will fall from the sky on the metropolis. The sky will burn at 45 degrees latitude." Skeptics were quick to point out that the verse doesn't mention New York or planes directly. But the public didn't care. Nostradamus had seen something that looked like now. Baba Vanga's predictions are usually simple, blunt, and haunting. She once spoke of a new illness that would spread around the world and make breathing difficult. During the COVID-19 pandemic, her followers revived this line, and even claimed she had predicted the virus would come from the ice, as permafrost melting in Siberia reveals ancient microbes never before seen by modern medicine. Whether or not the quote was exact, the resonance was real. Jeane Dixon is best remembered for predicting John F. Kennedy's death. In a 1956 magazine interview, she said a Democrat would win in 1960 and die in office. When Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, her name exploded. Never mind that she also predicted Nixon would win. The public remembered the hit. And when political leaders began falling, when scandals filled the headlines, people said, "Dixon warned us." Even her critics admitted she had the ear of presidents for a reason. It's not just what they saw. It's how their visions adapted. Prophets rarely survive history as people. They survive as symbols. Nostradamus became the template, the default image of a prophet. His quatrains endlessly recycled in books, films, and documentaries. Cayce became the spiritual grandfather of holistic medicine. Vanga is reborn in every viral meme about future disasters. Dixon is evoked every time a political death is framed as fated. But beneath all that, there's a deeper, quieter thread, the way these figures interpreted suffering. None of them promised a painless future, but all of them, in their own way, suggested that hardship was not random. Cayce believed in karmic cycles, illnesses as echoes of spiritual imbalance. Nostradamus portrayed war as a consequence of unchecked ambition. Vanga warned that arrogance led to punishment. Dixon spoke of morality as the thin thread holding civilization together. Each saw the future not as a static destination, but a fluid consequence of human behavior. Their prophecies weren't just warnings, they were mirrors. When Nostradamus spoke of cities reduced to ash, he wasn't just describing fire. He was reflecting on how easily we build towers without foundations. When Vanga warned of plagues, she wasn't just predicting viruses, she was speaking to the brittleness of modern arrogance. When Cayce talked about the earth shifting, he was urging humanity to align with something greater than profit and power. When Dixon warned of political betrayal, she was describing the cost of losing faith not just in leaders, but in truth itself. And what about their relationship to authority? That, too, is a pattern. None of them were rulers, but all were sought by rulers. Cayce treated the rich and powerful, even when he asked for no money. Nostradamus wrote for queens and hid warnings in riddles. Vanga was consulted by communist officials despite their public rejection of religion. Dixon's horoscopes found their way into the hands of U.S. presidents. Authority, it seems, is drawn to prophecy not because it trusts it, but because it fears being blindsided. Power fears the unknown, and prophets, in their own strange way, claim to reduce that fear. Their words offer an illusion of control. If disaster is coming, at least someone saw it. If tragedy strikes, maybe it was fated. This comfort, this need to assign meaning is part of why prophets endure, even when their predictions fail. It's not accuracy that keeps them alive. It's relevance. Even their failures reveal something. Dixon's many incorrect predictions are often forgotten, while her one accurate call about Kennedy is immortalized. Nostradamus has been credited with predicting everything from 9/11s to COVID, even when the verses are vague or mistranslated. Cayce's failed timelines for Atlantis don't seem to discredit the healing stories. Vanga's supposed quotes about global wars are hard to trace, but they still circulate. It's not about what they said. It's about what people need to hear. That's the secret at the heart of prophecy. People don't listen to prophets to know the future. They listen to feel less alone in the present. They want someone to tell them the unease they feel isn't madness, that the tension in the air, the chaos in politics, the sense that something's coming. It has a name. It's been seen before. It's part of a cycle. Prophets give language to that feeling. They offer story, meaning, even when the world spins, even when gnats burn and systems fall apart, the prophet's voice is a constant whisper. This has all happened before. And so we see the patterns: disease, collapse, renewal, betrayal, awakening. The world doesn't move in straight lines. It spirals. Each prophet, in their own way, marked a point on that spiral. Not to predict where we would land, but to remind us there's a shape to it all. This is why prophecy always returns during crisis. It's why Nostradamus becomes popular during war. Why Cayce surges during health panics. Why Vanga's words trend after disasters. Why Dixon's name resurfaces in political upheaval. When the world feels unstable, prophecy becomes the thread that ties chaos to meaning. We don't ask these figures to be right. We ask them to reflect our fears back to us, just structured enough to feel manageable, just vague enough to apply, just mysterious enough to make us pause. That's the power in their silence, too. The things they didn't explain. The questions they left open. The verses that don't quite fit. These gaps invite interpretation. They give the reader a role. They make the prophecy collaborative. Prophets don't give us answers. They give us frames. And maybe that's the point. Maybe it was never about knowing the future, but about surviving the present with the feeling that someone, somewhere, understood. 4 voices, spread across centuries, connected not by language, or culture, or religion, but by their ability to name the storm before it arrives. And the storm, in some form, always arrives. History listens not just with curiosity, but with hope. That in the echoes of these strange lives, we might catch a glimpse of our own. And if we do, maybe we won't feel quite so lost. Every prophecy that comes true draws a circle of believers closer. But what about the ones that don't? What do we do with the verses that remain in limbo, unsolved, unfulfilled, or delayed beyond reason? When a prophet dies and the world goes on without their final prediction ever materializing, is that a failure? Or is it something else? All 4 figures we've explored left behind prophecies that hang in the air like unsent letters. Edgar Cayce warned of a shift in the earth. A magnetic field so dramatic it would rewrite coastlines. He described it in specific terms. Japan sinking, New York City flooding, pole reversals, California falling into the sea. Some of those themes have shown glimmers of reality in modern times. Extreme weather, rising sea levels, even measurable magnetic drift. But the apocalyptic timeline, it hasn't happened. Not yet. Cayce also spoke of Atlantis rising, not metaphorically, but as a literal continent returning from beneath the ocean. He even gave dates. Those dates have long passed, and yet his believers haven't abandoned the idea. Some argue he spoke symbolically, that the rising of Atlantis represents the resurgence of lost wisdom. Others point to underwater, Anomalies off the coasts of Cuba and Japan as evidence that something ancient waits below. But Atlantis, as Cayce envisioned it, has not returned. Nostradamus was never one for clarity. His quatrains leave more open than closed, and yet certain verses still feel like they're ticking. There's one that speaks of a final pope who would lead the church through fire and tribulation. That line has gained renewed attention with each new papal election, especially when Pope Francis assumed office as the first Jesuit pope and arguably the most reformist voice in centuries. Some believe he fits the mold. Others wait for someone even more disruptive. Then there is the prophecy about a great war beginning in the East and sweeping across the world, with fire and blood raining from the skies in the 20th century. People tied it to Hiroshima. In the 21st, to tensions in the South China Sea, in Ukraine, or in the Middle East. But so far, the world remains on the edge, trembling. Yes, but not yet consumed. Baba Vanga's prophecies stretch far beyond her lifetime. She claimed a new energy source would be discovered in Venus, that a child born in 2005 would one day change the world, that by the late 21st century, humanity would have contact with beings from other worlds. None of that has occurred. Her believers don't mind. They say her timelines were never exact, or that she saw possible futures, not guaranteed outcomes. And Jeane Dixon, she once predicted the second coming of Christ would occur sometime round the year 2000. That came and went. She warned of a massive cataclysm that never materialized. In the decades since her death, her reputation has faded, but her effect on American spiritual culture, and the way she helped normalize prophecy in modern media, continues. There's a common thread here. When predictions go unfulfilled, we don't discard them, we reinterpret, we reschedule, we fold them into the future as possibilities instead of certainties. Prophecy becomes not a fixed roadmap, but a kind of language for what might happen, shaped by what we're willing to believe. But even this has meaning, because often the power of a prophecy lies not in its accuracy, but in the way people respond to it. Cayce's predictions inspired decades of alternative medicine and spiritual reflection. Nostradamus's warnings created entire industries of coded analysis. Vanga's stark foresight became a cultural glue in the Balkans. Dixon's blend of religion and politics gave permission for public figures to consult stars without shame. So what remains unfulfilled is not necessarily a failure. It's a space, a tension. An open thread we keep pulling at, prophecy, when it doesn't come true, becomes a canvas. We project our current fears onto it. Global pandemics, AI dominance, environmental collapse, political breakdown, all of these modern crises find homes in the vague yet powerful verses of the long dead. We update the prophecies even if the prophets can't. Still, what if some of them did see something? Not in the way of newspapers or coordinates, but in patterns, emotional weather, spiritual fractures, the trembling of history before it breaks open. Maybe what they saw wasn't a calendar event, but a shadow moving ahead of us. Maybe the reason we revisit their words isn't just because we need hope, but because something about those words feels familiar, like a place we've never been, but somehow recognize. And that familiarity, That pulse of déjà vu when we read a line written centuries ago and feel it touched today. Maybe that is the prophecy. Not a forecast, but a mirror. A story that keeps writing itself. So what remains unfulfilled? Much. Entire verses. Old timelines. Predictions left behind like puzzle pieces missing their final shape. But what remains unshaken is this, the urge to look ahead, to seek meaning, to trust that if the future holds answers, someone, someday, might still be listening, and if we listen closely enough, perhaps we'll find not what's written in stone, but what's waiting in silence. Maybe, just maybe, they really did see something, and maybe, so can we.